Imagine a job where saying "I do" meant getting a pink slip. Or a career where the state itself demanded you live without a partner for 3 whole decades, with a truly terrifying penalty waiting if you dared to break that rule. For countless people throughout history, their profession was not just a way to earn a living. It was a path that often led, by choice or by force, to a life without marriage. From sacred duties performed in ancient temples to the cutting edge of brand new technologies, certain careers came with an unwritten or sometimes very explicitly written understanding: no spouse allowed. Get ready to explore some historical jobs that practically asked for a vow of singleness. Number 8. Early telephone operators connecting the world, but disconnecting from marriage. When the telephone first crackled into life in the late 19th century, it was a marvel, a revolution. Suddenly, voices could travel across miles in an instant, but making that magic happen required a human touch, a new kind of worker, the telephone operator. In the early days, young men, often teenage boys who had previously worked as telegraph messengers, were hired for these roles. However, reports from the time suggest their conduct was sometimes less than professional. Subscribers complained of pranks and rude remarks. Telephone companies quickly sought an alternative. They found it in young women. The belief at the time was that women possessed a more pleasant-speaking voice, were naturally more polite, and would be more patient with sometimes frustrated callers. They were also seen as more dexterous, able to handle the complex web of cords and plugs on the switchboards with greater speed and accuracy. Another factor, often unstated but understood, was that women could generally be paid less than men for similar work. So, the era of the "hello girl" began. This new opportunity for women came with significant strings attached, especially concerning marriage. Many telephone companies like Bell Telephone System and its associated companies had explicit policies known as marriage bars. These rules stated that female employees were expected to resign upon getting married. If a woman married and tried to keep it a secret, she could be dismissed if discovered. The reasoning behind these bars was multifaceted. Some managers believed that a married woman's primary responsibility was to her home and husband, and that her job performance would suffer. There was a concern that married women might be less reliable, taking more time off for family matters. Others thought husbands would not want their wives working, especially in roles that might involve night shifts or interaction with the public. The job was often framed as a respectable but temporary position for young single women before they settled down to their true calling of matrimony and motherhood. The daily life of an early telephone operator was demanding and highly regimented. They worked in large, often noisy rooms, sitting on stools in front of massive switchboards, sometimes called positions. These boards were walls of jacks, lights, and cords. An operator's shift could be long, often 8 to 10 hours, sometimes including nights, weekends, and holidays, because telephone service needed to be available around the clock. The work was physically taxing. Operators had to sit upright, often forbidden from leaning back, and constantly reach and plug cords. Repetitive motion injuries were not uncommon. Each operator typically managed a section of the switchboard. When a small light, called a pilot lamp, lit up above a jack, it signaled an incoming call. The operator would plug one end of a cord into that jack, flip a key, and say a phrase like "number please" or "operator." Upon hearing the desired number, she would take the other end of the cord, test the requested line to see if it was busy, and then plug the cord into the correct jack to connect the call. If it was a long-distance call, she might have to connect through several other operators in different exchanges or cities. She had to record details for billing, especially for toll calls. The pace could be relentless, especially during peak hours. An experienced operator might handle hundreds of calls per hour. Supervision was constant and strict. Supervisors, often older, more experienced former operators, would patrol the aisles, listening in on calls to monitor for speed, accuracy, and adherence to company scripts and rules of etiquette. Demerits could be given for mispronouncing words, speaking too loudly or too softly, using incorrect phrases, or being perceived as impolite. Personal conversations, while on duty, were forbidden. Operators were even judged on their posture and their tone of voice. Pressure to be efficient and error-free was immense. A mistake could mean a disconnected call, a wrong number, or an overcharge, all leading to customer complaints. Training for these positions was rigorous. New recruits, often young women in their late teens or early 20s with at least a grade school education, underwent weeks of instruction. They had to memorize lists of local exchanges, common businesses, and sometimes even the names of individual subscribers. They learned how to operate the switchboard, practiced handling different types of calls, and were drilled in voice modulation and clear enunciation. Portment and a neat appearance were also emphasized. Some companies had height requirements, as operators needed to be able to reach all parts of their assigned switchboard panel. Socially, telephone operators occupied a unique space. They were among the first large groups of women to enter the technical workforce and public life. The image of the hello girl was often romanticized in popular culture, portrayed as glamorous, modern, and efficient. However, there were also concerns. Some worried about the moral implications of young women working late hours or in close proximity to male employees or the public. The work itself was often undervalued, seen as requiring patience and politeness rather than significant technical skill, despite the complexity of the systems. For many young women, the job provided a degree of economic independence and a sense of purpose outside the home, even if it was understood to be temporary. The wages, while lower than men's, were often better than those available in domestic service or factory work. The operator's lounge or restroom could become a space of camaraderie where women shared experiences and supported each other. The end of an operator's career, at least in the early decades, was frequently tied to marriage. Upon announcing her engagement, a woman was generally expected to give her notice. If she married secretly, the risk of discovery and dismissal loomed. This system persisted for many years. It was only gradually, particularly around times of labor shortage like World War I and World War II, and with changing social norms and legal challenges, that marriage bars began to be questioned and eventually dismantled. As telephone technology evolved with automatic switching systems, the number of operators needed decreased, and the nature of the job changed. But for its pioneering era, being a telephone operator very often meant choosing between a career and a marriage. Number 7. Knights Templar, soldiers of Christ, wedded to the order. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a new kind of warrior emerged in Europe and the Holy Land, the knight who was also a monk. Among the most famous and formidable of these were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. Founded around 1119, their initial purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem after its capture during the First Crusade. What began as a small band of knights soon grew into one of the most powerful and wealthy organizations in the medieval world. Membership in the Knights Templar, like in other religious military orders, such as the Knights Hospitaller or Teutonic Knights, involved taking monastic vows. These vows typically included poverty, chastity, and obedience. The vow of chastity was a direct commitment to remaining unmarried and celibate. This was not merely a practical consideration for a soldier who might be away on campaign for years. It was a core tenet of their religious identity. They were considered warrior monks, dedicating their lives entirely to God and the defense of Christendom. Marriage, family, and personal attachments were seen as distractions from this sacred duty. The Latin Rule, the official code governing Templar life, which was adapted from the Benedictine Rule, laid out strict guidelines for behavior. It prescribed details about their prayer life, their communal living, their clothing, their diet, and their conduct in battle. The emphasis was on discipline, austerity, and devotion. The rule explicitly forbade contact with women that could lead to temptation or scandal. Knights were not supposed to kiss any woman, not even their mother or sister. While these rules were common in monastic orders, they took on a particular significance for men who were also elite, heavily armed warriors. Daily life for a Knight Templar varied, depending on his location and role. Those in the East, in Crusader, states like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, were often engaged in active military campaigns against Muslim forces, garrisoning castles or escorting pilgrims. Their lives were a combination of rigorous military training, religious services, and the harsh realities of frontier warfare. They would rise early for prayers, attend Mass, and then engage in drills, weapon practice, and horsemanship. Meals were often taken in silence, sometimes with scripture being read aloud. They slept in communal dormitories. Their distinctive uniform was a white mantle or cloak emblazoned with a red cross, a symbol that made them instantly recognizable. Templars in Europe, in the numerous commanderies or preceptories established across various kingdoms, had different responsibilities. These estates were vital for generating revenue, recruiting new members, and providing logistical support for the Templars' activities in the East. Knights in these commanderies managed agricultural lands, oversaw finances, and maintained local chapels. While perhaps less overtly martial than their brethren in the Holy Land, they still lived under the same rule, with its demands for piety and celibacy. To become a Knight Templar, a man typically had to be of noble birth, free, and in good health, could not be married or betrothed. If he had previously been married, he could only join if his wife consented to enter a religious order herself, or if she was deceased. He could not be in debt, or already a member of another religious order without permission. The initiation ceremony was a solemn affair, often conducted in secret. The recruit would be questioned about his suitability and his willingness to accept the rigors of Templar life. He would then profess his vows, committing himself to the order for life. Templars developed a reputation for their fierceness in battle and their unwavering discipline. They were often at the forefront of Crusader armies, acting as shock troops. Their commitment to fighting to the death, rather than retreating without orders, made them formidable opponents. However, their wealth and power also attracted suspicion and envy. They had amassed vast landholdings across Europe, operated a sophisticated international banking system, and were answerable only to the Pope. This independence, combined with the secrecy surrounding some of their rituals, fueled rumors and accusations. The vow of chastity was central to the Templar ethos. It reinforced their identity as men set apart, dedicated wholly to a spiritual and military mission. A family life was incompatible with the constant readiness for deployment, the communal living, and the religious asceticism demanded by the order. The Templar was, in a sense, married to the order itself. His brothers in arms were his family. His purpose was not to build a personal lineage, but to serve Christ and protect the faithful. The end of the Knights Templar was swift and brutal. In the early 14th century, King Philip I of France, who was heavily indebted to the order, orchestrated a campaign to destroy them. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Templars across France were arrested. They were accused of numerous heresies, including denying Christ, spitting on the cross, idol worship, and institutionalized sodomy. Many of these accusations were extracted under torture. Despite the lack of credible evidence for most of the charges, and protest from some quarters, Pope Clement V, under pressure from King Philip, officially suppressed the order in 1312. Templar property was confiscated and largely transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. Many Templars were imprisoned, and some, including the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, were burned at the stake. For the nearly 2 centuries of their existence, the Knights Templar represented a unique fusion of military prowess and monastic devotion. The vow of singleness was not an incidental aspect of their lives. It was a foundational element of their identity and their operational effectiveness, ensuring their undivided loyalty to God and the order. Number 6. Governesses educating children, but isolated from society's marriage market. In the grand houses of the wealthy during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, a solitary female figure often moved through the rooms. The governess. Her role was to educate and care for the children of the household, typically girls and younger boys, teaching them subjects like languages, music, drawing, arithmetic, history, and proper deportment. She was more than a servant, but far from a member of the family, existing in a peculiar and often lonely social limbo. This unique position, combined with societal expectations, meant that a career as a governess very often precluded marriage. There was no formal vow of singleness for governesses, but the practicalities of the job and the social structures of the time created strong barriers to matrimony. Governess lived in her employer's home, entirely dependent on them for her board, lodging, and salary. Her life was circumscribed by the needs of the children and the rules of the household. She had little personal time or freedom. Opportunities to meet eligible men of her own social class were scarce. She was not considered a suitable social companion for the family she served, nor could she easily socialize with the other servants, from whom she was separated by her education and background. Many governesses came from genteel but impoverished backgrounds. They were often the daughters of clergymen, military officers, or merchants who had fallen on hard times. Teaching was one of the few respectable occupations open to educated women who needed to support themselves. However, the very act of working for a living could diminish a woman's marriage prospects in an era when a husband was expected to be the sole provider. Society often viewed governesses with a mixture of pity and slight disdain. They were ladies by birth and education, but had been forced into a dependent employee status. The daily life of a governess was structured around the children's schedules. She would rise early, supervise their morning routines, conduct lessons in the schoolroom, accompany them on walks, oversee their meals, and perhaps help them prepare for bed. Curriculum could be demanding, and she was expected to be proficient in a range of subjects. Beyond academic instruction, she was responsible for instilling moral values and social graces. She spent almost all her waking hours with her charges, leaving little room for a personal life. Evenings might be spent preparing lessons for the next day or mending clothes, often alone in her small room, which might be located in a remote part of the house. Her relationship with her employers could be complex and fraught with unspoken tensions. She was expected to be deferential and to know her place. While some families treated their governesses with kindness and respect, others could be demanding, critical, or aloof. The lady of the house might see the governess as a rival for her children's affections, or as a reminder of her own educational deficiencies. The master of the house might be indifferent, or worse, might make unwelcome advances, putting the governess in an incredibly vulnerable position with little recourse. Loneliness was a common complaint among governesses. Isolated from her own family and friends, and unable to form equal relationships within the household, She could feel like an outsider in every sense. Letters were a vital link to the outside world, but correspondence could not fully compensate for the lack of daily companionship and social interaction with peers. Constant proximity to a family unit, with its intimate bonds and affections, could also highlight her own unmarried, childless state. Finding a husband while employed as a governess was extremely difficult. Her social circle was tiny. If a man of suitable standing did show interest, the family employing her might disapprove, fearing the loss of her services or feeling that such a connection was inappropriate. Romantic involvement with someone in the household, such as a tutor or an older son of the family, was usually frowned upon and could lead to instant dismissal and a ruined reputation. While fiction sometimes portrayed governesses marrying into the aristocracy, the reality was usually far more mundane and challenging. The financial situation of governesses was often precarious. Salaries were generally low, barely enough to live on, let alone save for the future. There was no job security. A governess could be dismissed at any time if the children grew up, if the family's circumstances changed, or simply on a whim. Old age was a particular source of anxiety, as there were no pensions. Some unfortunate governesses ended their days in poverty or reliant on charity. Organizations like the Governess's Benevolent Institution were founded in the mid-19th century to provide assistance to those in distress. For a woman to leave her position as a governess to marry, she usually needed to have found a suitor independently, perhaps through her own family connections during a rare holiday, or to marry someone of a lower social standing, which was also often viewed negatively. Some governesses did marry, but many others remained single for their entire lives, either by circumstance or in some cases by a quiet choice to pursue a degree of intellectual and economic independence, however limited. The role of the governess began to decline in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the rise of formal schooling for girls and changing social structures. But for generations of women, this demanding and isolating profession often meant a life lived largely without the prospect of marriage and family of their own. Number 5. Early female teachers in America, shaping minds, but often bound by marriage bans. In the expanding landscape of 19th and early 20th century America, the demand for teachers grew rapidly, especially with the Common School movement advocating for public education. While men initially dominated the profession, women increasingly stepped into classrooms, particularly in elementary schools and rural one-room schoolhouses. They were seen as natural nurturers, more patient with young children, and, crucially for budget-conscious school boards, they could be hired for significantly lower salaries than men. However, this opportunity often came with a very personal cost, a requirement, spoken or unspoken, to remain single." End quote. Marriage bars were prevalent in the teaching profession for women across the United States for many decades. These were formal policies enacted by school districts that prohibited the hiring of married women and often mandated the resignation or dismissal of female teachers who got married. The rationale offered for these policies was varied. Some school officials and community members believed that a married woman's primary duty was to her husband and future family. Teaching was seen as a secondary concern that would inevitably suffer. There was a perception that married women would be less dedicated, more prone to absenteeism due to family responsibilities, or that they might become pregnant and require extended leave, which was rarely provided. Another argument, rooted in economic concerns, was that a married woman presumably had a husband to support her, and therefore a teaching job should go to a single woman who needed to support herself, or to a man who was assumed to be supporting a family. In times of economic downturn like the Great Depression, these arguments became even more pronounced as jobs were scarce. The image of the ideal teacher was often that of a devoted, almost maternal figure, but one whose nurturing instincts were to be directed solely towards her pupils, not her own children or spouse. She was expected to be a model of propriety and moral uprightness in the community, and for some, this image was more easily maintained by a single woman. The daily life of an early female teacher, especially in a rural one-room schoolhouse, was incredibly demanding. She was often solely responsible for students of all ages, from young children learning their alphabet to older students tackling more advanced subjects. Her day began long before the students arrived, perhaps with lighting the stove to heat the schoolroom in winter, sweeping the floor and preparing lessons. She taught all subjects: reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, and sometimes music or art. She had to manage classroom discipline, often with limited resources. Her responsibilities frequently extended beyond academics. She was expected to instill good manners, hygiene, and patriotism. Teachers were often poorly paid. Their salaries were a fraction of what male teachers or men in other professions earned. Contracts were typically for a single school year, and rehiring was not guaranteed. Job security was minimal. Many teachers had to board out, living with local families in the community, sometimes rotating among households. This meant little privacy and constant scrutiny. Her personal conduct, both inside and outside the classroom, was closely watched by the community. She was expected to attend church, participate in community events, and maintain an impeccable reputation. Any hint of scandal or behavior deemed inappropriate could lead to dismissal. Path to becoming a teacher in the 19th century often involved attending a normal school, which was a teacher training institution, or perhaps just having a higher level of education than most in the community. Appointments gradually became more standardized, but for many years, dedication and a willingness to work under challenging conditions were key qualifications. The expectation of singleness profoundly shaped the lives of these women. For many, teaching was not just a job but a calling, a way to contribute meaningfully to society and to achieve a degree of intellectual and economic autonomy. However, the choice to pursue this calling often meant forgoing marriage and family, or at least postponing it. If a teacher wished to marry, she usually had to resign her position. This led to a high turnover rate in the profession, as many young women taught for a few years before marrying and leaving the workforce. Some women chose to remain single and dedicate their entire lives to teaching, becoming respected figures in their communities, though they might also face the social stigma sometimes attached to unmarried women or spinsters in that era. The loneliness and isolation could be profound, especially for teachers in remote rural areas. They had limited opportunities for social interaction with peers or potential partners. The opposition to marriage bars grew over time. Women's rights advocates, teacher unions, and some educators began to challenge these discriminatory policies. They argued that a woman's marital status had no bearing on her ability to be an effective teacher, and that such rules were unfair and deprived schools of experienced educators. During periods of teacher shortage, such as wartime, some districts would temporarily relax these rules, only to reinstate them later. It was a long and slow process, but gradually, through legal challenges and shifting societal attitudes about working women, marriage bars began to crumble, particularly after World War II. However, for a significant period in American history, the path of a female teacher was one that often demanded a de facto commitment to singleness if she wished to remain in her chosen profession. This created a workforce of dedicated educators who shaped generations of students, often at great personal sacrifice. Number 4. Lighthouse keepers, guardians of the light, often alone with the sea. Along treacherous coastlines and isolated islands around the world, lighthouses stood as vital sentinels, their powerful beams of light guiding ships safely away from hidden rocks and dangerous shoals. For centuries before automation, these beacons required constant human attention. The individuals who performed this critical, demanding, and often incredibly solitary job were the lighthouse keepers. While not all lighthouse keepers were single, the extreme isolation, harsh conditions, and relentless nature of the work made it a career that often led to, or was best suited for, a life of practical singleness, especially in the most remote locations. A lighthouse keeper's primary duty was to keep the light burning, no matter what. This was a task of immense responsibility, as the lives of countless mariners depended on it. From dusk till dawn, and during foggy or stormy weather, the lamp had to be lit and maintained. In the days of oil lamps, this meant trimming wicks, cleaning lenses and lantern rooms, refueling the lamp, and, if the lighthouse had a rotating optic, winding the clockwork mechanism that turned it. This mechanism often required winding every few hours, day and night. Any failure of the light could have catastrophic consequences. The isolation was perhaps the most defining characteristic of a lighthouse keeper's life, particularly for those stationed on offshore rocks or remote uninhabited islands. Keepers could go for weeks, sometimes months, without seeing another human being apart from their assistant if they had one. Supplies and mail might be delivered irregularly, depending on weather conditions and the accessibility of the station. Contact with the outside world was minimal. The vast expanse of the sea, the cry of gulls, and the howl of the wind were their constant companions. For a married keeper, bringing a family to such a location was often impractical or impossible. Many lighthouse dwellings were small and basic, designed for one or two men. The environment could be dangerous for children. Access to schooling, medical care, and social interaction for a spouse and children was severely limited or non-existent. While some lighthouse stations, particularly those on the mainland or larger islands, did accommodate families, many of the most critical and exposed posts were effectively bachelor stations. Even if a keeper was married, he might spend the majority of his year alone at his post, separated from his family who lived on the mainland. The work was physically demanding and relentless. Keepers had to be self-sufficient, capable of performing repairs to the lamp, the machinery, and sometimes the structure itself. They had to be able to endure extreme weather, from violent storms that sent waves crashing over the tower to BK fog that lasted for days. They needed to be vigilant, observant, and meticulous in their record-keeping, noting weather conditions, shipping traffic, and the consumption of supplies. There was no room for complacency. The daily routine was governed by the light. During the day, the keeper would clean the lantern room, polish the intricate Fresnel lens, a marvel of optical engineering that could weigh several tons but had to be kept spotlessly clean, and prepare the lamp for the night. At sunset, the lamp would be lit. Throughout the night, the keeper had to monitor it, ensuring it burned brightly, and if applicable, rotated at the correct speed. Sleep was often taken in short watches or snatched between tasks. Mental fortitude was as crucial as physical stamina. The profound solitude could take a toll. Keepers had to find ways to combat loneliness and boredom. Many took up hobbies like reading, wood carving, painting, or studying the natural world around them. Some became avid bird watchers or fishermen. However, the psychological pressures of isolation, coupled with the immense responsibility, were significant. Stories abound of keepers who struggled with the solitude, or of tensions arising between keepers sharing a confined space for long periods. To become a lighthouse keeper, a man typically needed to be in excellent physical health, reliable, and possess some mechanical aptitude. Appointments were often made through government agencies responsible for maritime safety. Former sailors or men with military experience were sometimes preferred. Training involved learning about the specific types of lamps and machinery used in lighthouses. Society viewed lighthouse keepers with a mixture of respect and romanticism. They were seen as heroic, steadfast figures, silently guarding the coasts. Their lives were often portrayed in literature and art as ones of rugged individualism and quiet dedication. However, the reality was often less romantic and more about enduring hardship and monotony for modest pay. For those keepers who were single, or who lived as if they were due to the separation from family, the lighthouse became their entire world. Their social interactions were limited to occasional visits from inspectors or supply boat crews. Marriage was a distant prospect for a man whose home was a stone tower on a desolate rock. If a keeper at an isolated station did marry, it often meant he would have to seek a transfer to a less remote, family-friendly station, or his wife would have to endure an equally isolated existence which was not always feasible or desired. With the advent of electricity, automatic lamp changers, and eventually full automation and remote monitoring systems in the 20th century, the need for resident lighthouse keepers gradually diminished. One by one, lighthouses were demand. The era of the traditional lighthouse keeper, with its profound solitude and unwavering dedication, came to a close. But their legacy remains in the steadfast lights that continue to shine, and in the stories of the men who for years on end lived lives practically defined by singleness in service of the sea. Number 3. Eunuchs of the imperial Chinese court, power and proximity, but at a profound personal cost. For over 2,000 years, from the Han Dynasty until the fall of the Tima Dynasty in 1912, eunuchs played a unique and often powerful role within the Forbidden City and the imperial palaces of China. They were men who had undergone castration, a surgical procedure that removed their ability to procreate. This physical alteration was the absolute prerequisite for their service in the inner court, particularly in close proximity to the emperor, his empress, and his many concubines. The institution of court eunuchs was built on the premise that men incapable of fathering children posed no threat to the imperial lineage or the chastity of the palace women. This fundamental requirement locked them into a life of permanent singleness in the traditional sense of marriage and fatherhood. The reasons men became eunuchs were varied. Some were prisoners of war or criminals who were castrated as punishment and then forced into servitude. Others were presented as tribute from foreign states. However, a significant number, especially in later dynasties like the Ming and Fani, came from impoverished families who saw it as a desperate path to potential wealth and influence for their sons. The operation was dangerous, often performed in unsanitary conditions with a high risk of infection or death. If a boy or young man survived, he would then seek employment in the palace. The act of castration was an irrevocable step, a complete severing from the possibility of a normal family life as understood by society. Once accepted into palace service, eunuchs performed a vast array of duties. They were not just domestic servants. While many did undertake tasks, such as cleaning, cooking, and attending to the personal needs of the imperial family, others rose to positions of immense power and responsibility. Eunuchs served as imperial bodyguards, managed palace workshops, maintained buildings and gardens, and acted as messengers. Crucially, they controlled access to the emperor. They were often the gatekeepers, deciding who could see him and what information reached him. Some eunuchs became trusted confidants and advisors to emperors, wielding considerable political influence, commanding armies, or even acting as diplomats. Their daily life within the sprawling complex of the Forbidden City was governed by strict hierarchies and protocols. There were thousands of eunuchs in imperial service during peak periods, organized into different departments and ranks, each with specific responsibilities and privileges. Low-ranking eunuchs might endure harsh conditions and menial labor, while high-ranking eunuchs could live in relative luxury, accumulating wealth and commanding their own subordinates. They had their own living quarters within the palace, separate from those of the imperial family and other officials. Despite their inability to have biological children, some high-ranking and wealthy eunuchs did form relationships that mimicked marriage. They might adopt other, younger eunuchs as sons, to create a form of lineage and to have someone care for them in old age and inherit their property. Some eunuchs were also known to have formed close, sometimes romantic relationships with palace maids, though actual marriage with women from outside the palace was generally forbidden or extremely rare and frowned upon. These relationships, however, could not ratuki the societal norm of marriage aimed at procreation and continuation of the family line. The training and education of eunuchs varied. Those destined for lower-level tasks might receive little formal education, while those identified as promising could be taught literacy, classic texts, and administrative skills. Their proximity to the seat of power meant they were often privy to state secrets and court intrigues. This access, combined with their unique status, sometimes allowed them to amass significant informal power. Throughout Chinese history, there were periods where eunuch factions became extraordinarily influential, sometimes clashing with the scholar official class who governed the empire. Figures like Wei Zongxian in the Ming dynasty or Li Lanying in the late Danzim dynasty became notorious for their power and alleged corruption. Societal perception of eunuchs was complex and often contradictory. They were essential for the functioning of the imperial household and the protection of the imperial family's purity. Yet they were also often viewed with suspicion, contempt, or fear by the Confucian scholar officials and the general populace. They were seen as incomplete men, existing outside the normal social order that highly valued family and ancestral lines. Their power was often considered illegitimate or corrupting. Derogatory terms were frequently used to describe them. Career of a eunuch was a gamble. For the vast majority, it meant a life of hard service with little reward. For a select few, it offered a path to unparalleled influence and riches, but this always came with risks. Change in emperor, a shift in court politics, or falling out of favor could lead to demotion, exile, or even execution. Because they had no natural family to rely on in old age or sickness, many eunuchs faced a lonely and impoverished end if they had not managed to accumulate wealth or secure the loyalty of adopted sons. Special temples or retirement homes were sometimes established for elderly and destitute eunuchs. The requirement of castration was the ultimate vow of singleness, a physical alteration that forever defined their social and personal lives. It was the price of entry into the exclusive world of the imperial court, a world that offered proximity to power, but demanded the sacrifice of one of the most fundamental aspects of human life, as understood in their culture. With the Yinhai Revolution and the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, the imperial system was abolished, and the institution of court eunuchs came to an end, closing a long and complex chapter in Chinese history, where thousands of men lived lives defined by service. Number 2. Catholic priests and nuns, a sacred calling, demanding celibacy. For centuries within the Roman Catholic Church, the path to becoming a priest, monk, or nun has been intrinsically linked to a solemn vow of celibacy. This means a commitment to abstain from marriage and sexual relations for life, dedicating oneself entirely to God and the service of the Church. While the historical development and theological underpinnings are complex, the practical outcome for these individuals has been a life lived without a spouse or biological children, a form of sacred singleness chosen in pursuit of a spiritual ideal. The tradition of celibacy for clergy in the Western Church developed gradually over the first millennium. Early church leaders and councils began to encourage or require it for bishops, priests, and deacons, partly inspired by scriptural passages valuing virginity and by the example of Jesus Christ and some of his apostles. The idea was that a celibate cleric could devote himself more fully to his ministry, unencumbered by family cares and worldly attachments. His family would be the church community. By the High Middle Ages, Particularly after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, clerical celibacy became more firmly established as a discipline in the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church, though it was not without periods of challenge and debate. For religious orders of monks and nuns, vows of poverty, chastity, which includes celibacy, and obedience, have been foundational since their earliest days, as exemplified by figures like Saint Benedict. The daily life of a Catholic priest varies greatly, depending on whether he is a diocesan priest serving a parish or a religious priest belonging to an order like the Franciscans, Dominicans, or Jesuits. Parish priest's life revolves around the spiritual care of his congregation. This includes celebrating Mass and other sacraments like baptism, confession, marriage for others, and anointing the sick. He provides religious instruction, preaches homilies, counsels parishioners, visits the sick and bereaved, and manages the administrative and financial affairs of the parish. His days can be long and unpredictable, filled with both joyful and sorrowful encounters. He lives often alone or with another priest, in a rectory usually attached to or near the church. Monks and nuns, on the other hand, typically live in communities, monasteries, convents, or abbeys under a specific rule of life. Their days are structured around prayer, work, and communal living. The Liturgy of the Hours, a cycle of prayers recited at specific times throughout the day and night, forms the backbone of their spiritual practice. Work, known by the Benedictine motto Ora et Labora, pray and work, can take many forms. Manual labor in fields or workshops, scholarly pursuits, teaching, healthcare, artistic endeavors, or hospitality. Meals are often taken in common, sometimes in silence, while one member reads from a spiritual text. Their lives are intended to be a witness to a different set of values centered on contemplation and service. The path to priesthood or religious life is a long one, involving years of discernment, education, and spiritual formation. For a man aspiring to be a diocesan priest, this typically involves completing a college degree followed by several years of seminary study, focusing on theology, philosophy, scripture, canon law, and pastoral ministry. For those joining religious orders, there is a period of postulancy and novitiate, where they experience the community's way of life and study its charism, before taking temporary vows and eventually perpetual vows. It is during this process that the commitment to celibacy is formally made. The vow of celibacy is understood not merely as a practical rule, but as a spiritual gift and a profound personal commitment. It is seen as a way to imitate Christ more closely, to be more fully available for God's service, and to bear witness to the kingdom of heaven. It is also recognized as a significant sacrifice, requiring grace, discipline, and ongoing spiritual support. The Church provides guidance and resources for priests and religious to live out this vow faithfully. Socially, priests and nuns have historically held respected and sometimes revered positions within Catholic communities. They are seen as spiritual leaders, teachers, and caregivers. However, they also live lives set apart. The celibate lifestyle, while esteemed, does distinguish them from the majority of lay Catholics, whose vocation is typically marriage and family life. This can sometimes lead to a degree of social isolation, though priests and religious often find deep fellowship within their presbyterates or communities and with the people they serve. The commitment to celibacy is for life. While there are provisions for priests or religious to be laicized, released from their clerical state or vows, under certain circumstances, this is generally a difficult and exceptional process. For the vast majority who remain, their life path is one defined by this foundational promise: they will not marry or have their own biological children. Their focus is on spiritual parenthood and service to a wider family of faith. The discipline of mandatory celibacy for priests in the Latin Rite has been a subject of ongoing discussion within the Church, with various arguments made for and against its continuation. However, for nuns, monks, and religious brothers, the vow of chastity remains a core element of their consecrated life across all traditions. For hundreds of years, countless men and women have chosen this path, embracing a life of singleness as part of their response to what they perceive as a divine calling, dedicating their entire beings to spiritual pursuits and the service of others. Number 1. Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred flames, guarded by a 30-year vow of chastity. In the heart of ancient Rome, near the Roman Forum, stood the temple of Vesta, home to a sacred, ever-burning flame. This fire was considered a symbol of the city's hearth, its continuity, and its divine protection. Entrusted with the solemn duty of tending this eternal flame and performing other vital religious rites, were a unique group of priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. Their role was one of immense honor and privilege, but it came with an extraordinarily strict requirement, a vow of chastity that lasted for 3 decades with the most severe penalty imaginable for its violation. The Vestal Order was ancient, its origins believed to date back to the legendary founding of Rome itself, possibly established by King Numa Pompilius. There were always 6 Vestal Virgins serving at any given time. They were chosen as young girls, typically between the ages of 6 and 10, from patrician families, meaning they had to be daughters of Rome's elite aristocracy. The selection process, known as captio, capture, was conducted by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. He would select a suitable girl who had to be free from physical and mental defects, and whose parents were both alive and freeborn Romans. Once chosen, the girl would leave her family and enter the service of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Her term of service was fixed at 30 years. This was divided into 3 distinct periods. 10 years as a novice, learning the intricate rituals and duties, 10 years performing these duties as a full priestess, and the final 10 years teaching and meriting the novices. During these 3 decades, the Vestal Virgin was absolutely bound by her vow of chastity. This vow was not merely symbolic, it was considered essential for the purity and efficacy of the rites she performed, and by extension, for the safety and well-being of Rome itself. A Vestal's virginity was thought to be mystically linked to the city's fortuna, or good fortune. If a Vestal Virgin was found to have broken her vow of chastity, an act known as incestum, unchastity, as her body was consecrated to the goddess, it was considered a dire sacrilege, polluting the state and angering the gods. Punishment was horrifyingly unique. Because her blood was sacred and could not be shed, she was not executed in a conventional way. Instead, she was taken in a closed litter, as if in a funeral procession, to a place called the Campus Celeratus, the Evil Field. There, an underground chamber was prepared, containing a small couch, a lamp, and a meager supply of food and water. The condemned Vestal would descend into this chamber, and then it would be sealed, burying her alive. Her male partner in the transgression, if identified, would be flogged to death in public. Such events were rare but profoundly shocking, sending ripples of fear and religious awe through Roman society. The daily life of a Vestal Virgin revolved around her sacred duties. Her most crucial task was to ensure that the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta never went out. If it did, it was considered a terrible omen for Rome, and the Vestal responsible could be severely punished, usually by scourging by the Pontifex Maximus. They also ritually prepared mola salsa, a mixture of sacred salt and roasted grain used in many state sacrifices. They guarded important state documents and sacred objects kept within the temple, including, according to legend, the Palladium, a statue of Pallas Athena believed to ensure Rome's safety. They participated in various public festivals and ceremonies, such as the Vestalia, the annual festival in honor of Vesta. Despite the severity of their vows, Vestal virgins enjoyed considerable privileges and honors, far exceeding those of ordinary Roman women. They lived in a grand house, the Atrium Vestae, adjacent to the temple, with comfortable living quarters and servants. They were legally independent, not subject to the patria potestas, paternal power, that controlled most Roman women. They could own property, make wills, and give evidence in court. They had special seats at public games and theatrical performances. When they traveled through the city in a carriage, they were preceded by a lictor, an attendant who usually accompanied high-ranking magistrates, and everyone, even consuls, had to make way for them. If a condemned criminal encountered a Vestal on his way to execution, he was automatically pardoned. Their persons were sacrosanct, and injuring a Vestal was a capital offense. After completing their 30 years of service, a Vestal was free to leave the order, return to private life, and marry. Some did choose this path, and marrying a former Vestal was considered a great honor, though it was relatively uncommon. Many, having spent the majority of their lives in a position of unique status and religious dedication, chose to remain within the Vestal community, continuing to live in the Atrium Vestae and enjoying the respect and security it offered. They would have been in their late 30s or early 40s by this time, past the usual age for a first marriage in Roman society. The institution of the Vestal virgins endured for over 1,000 years, a testament to its profound importance in Roman religious and civic life. They were symbols of purity, continuity, and the Sacred Heart of the Roman state. Their lives were a paradox, highly public yet secluded, privileged yet bound by awesome and terrifying responsibilities. 30-year vow of chastity, with its life or death implications, defined their existence, making them perhaps the most striking example in the ancient world of a career that absolutely demanded a prolonged period of singleness, all in service to the goddess and the Roman people. The sacred flame was finally extinguished in 394 Common Era by the Christian Emperor Theodosius I, bringing an end to this ancient and extraordinary priesthood.